Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. Today, we are discussing US President Donald Trump's proposal to charge reciprocal tariffs on all countries that the US trades with, and in particular India, and its effect that it could have on Indian exports and the Indian economy. We're also going to discuss the possibility of India entering into a bilateral trade agreement with the US. We do have a delegation from the US that has begun negotiations with the Indian government in Delhi today, in fact. We have a distinguished panel before us today. I'd like to introduce them to you. We start with Nina Shenoy. She's a partner at the law firm of Wilmer Hale based in Washington, D.C. Nina is a part of the international trade practice, where she advises on issues such as sanctions, export controls, import and customs, and trade policy. Nina was previously the chief legal counsel and head of compliance at Medtronic, and she's worked in different roles within the US government and for members of the US Congress. We also have Vijay Singh Chauhan, who is a director tax at Deloitte. He's a public policy veteran with over 30 years of experience in trade facilitation and compliance, customs advance rulings, fiscal policy, and bilateral investment treaties. He's formerly an officer of the Indian Revenue Service and has held numerous positions within the Indian government, including Principal Commissioner of Customs, Customs Authority for Advance Ruling, and as an officer in the Finance Minister's office. We have Mark Linscott. He's the former Assistant Trade Representative, US Trade Representative for South and Central Asian Affairs within the US government, and was responsible for development of trade policies for numerous countries, including India. Mark has held numerous positions within the US government in his role as a trade representative and then in the Department of Commerce, spanning a period of more than 30 years. And finally, we have Gaura Sengupta, who is a chief economist at IDFC First Bank, one of India's leading banks. She's previously been the India economist for Yes Bank and for Morgan Stanley. She has an MA from the Delhi School of Economics. Gaura is a frequent commentator on Indian news media on the Indian economy and the investment climate in India. Welcome to all my panelists today, and thank you for taking part in this debate. My first question is to Nina. We hear so much about these trade wars that President Trump has started. But there are actually executive orders and memos that have been issued by the US government. So I wanted to ask you, what exactly is contained in those executive orders and memos? What's the approach coming from here? And what exactly has been proposed when it comes to bilateral these tariffs?
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, and it's really great to be with you all today. I'm particularly happy to be with this group. My family hails from Karnataka in India, so thanks for having me. So, Stephen, to answer your question, let me step back a second to provide some context. So, over the last decade or so, we have seen a very significant shift in how the United States has approached international trade issues. And the U.S. used to go to the World Trade Organization through the rules-based system to try to enforce its rights. And it has moved to a more unilateral approach on international trade, which is driven really by the underlying notion that U.S. trading partners have not treated the U.S. fairly in our trading relationships. And we've also seen not only, you mentioned tariffs, but also the use of other trade tools, things like sanctions, export controls, as really the tools of national security and foreign policy under the Trump administration. The first Trump administration actually continued through the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration in 2.0 is taking this to a new level. So if we look at what the distinguishing factors are for the Trump 2.0 trade policy, I would note a few things. One, in terms of style, there are three things. So there's unilateralism. So, and it's not just about the US doing it alone, as I was talking about, but also the president acting without Congress, because in the US system, Congress actually has the authority under the US Constitution to conduct trade with other nations, but the president is largely taking these authorities and using them. The president is also very transactional. So he wants to make deals, and every deal is a zero sum with a clear winner, a clear loser. Also quite experimental. So the president uses unconventional legal and policy tools to try to push the boundaries of US policy and US law. And then there's the substance. So the themes are, I would say, three things. One is fairness and reciprocity, as I mentioned, which you mentioned, Stephen, in terms of the reciprocal tariffs, which I'll mention in a second. Tariffs, really as a standby solution to achieve trade and non-trade objectives. And then a global reordering, so an inclination to attack allies and also flatter adversaries. And in the run-up to the inauguration, there were rumors that President Trump would impose a universal tariff, so just across the board on day one. Instead, he issued a flurry of executive orders and these executive memoranda, Stephen, that you mentioned, on numerous topics, and including this executive memorandum on America First trade policy, which kind of lays out the overall framework of the areas that the administration is looking to focus on. And there are actually reports from this memorandum that are due on April 1st. We thought that this would be, tariffs would be pushed to April 1st in terms of, the reports and looking at the reports that were supposed to be issued then. But we know that that's not the case. So the president has really relentlessly employed tariff actions, very significant ones, based on trade and national security authorities on a whole host of US trading partners. So specific tariffs, we've seen Canada, Mexico, China, and global tariffs on specific sectors. So think imports of steel, aluminum, derivative products, and he's threatening more. Getting to the reciprocal tariffs, next week, April 2nd, the president has called this Liberation Day. So there's a vast amount of mixed messages that are coming out of the Trump administration about what next week may look like. But we need to look back to February in the presidential memorandum that announced these reciprocal tariffs. So this fair and reciprocal tariff plan, I'm quoting from this, will seek to correct longstanding imbalances in international trade and ensure fairness across the board. Gone are the days of America being taken advantage of. This plan will put the American worker first, improve our competitiveness on every industry, reduce our trade deficit, and bolster our economic and national security. So this gives you a sense of where the president is going. India is actually mentioned as one of the countries where there are significant concerns with respect to the trade deficit. In fact, out of the examples given, there are 5. The memorandum's fact sheet notes the differential between the tariff rate imposed by India of 39% on agricultural goods versus 5% by the US, or 100% tariff on motorcycles, where the US charges 2.4%. So there's a concern of this trade deficit, a focus on, and this is quote, the dirty 15 countries where the US has trade deficits. And that will be the focus, as we understand, of these reciprocal tariffs. The president also indicated an interest to impose tariffs on pharma, autos, and semiconductors. We don't know whether the president is going to pick a certain number, which will apply across the board for certain for certain products on certain countries. The administration has said it will look to not apply sector specific tariffs in the next week. But if I were to engage in some crystal ball gazing, I imagine that some additional tariffs will be imposed next week. I'll leave with a quick point of optimism here. Stephen mentioned the trade negotiations. Because the president is so transactional, I think India is uniquely positioned, given the rapport between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, to take advantage of opportunities to grow this relationship. And so the talks will be tough, but nevertheless an opportunity.
Thanks, Nina. I have heard this term, the Dirty 15, which is the top 15 countries that have where the US have trade deficits, and I noticed I think India is number 9 out of that top 15. Mark, I wanted to go to you next, and I guess you're aware of some history here with trade negotiations with India, and particularly during the Trump 1 administration, right?
Yes, I do have a lot of experience. Exactly.
What happened during Trump 1?
Well, first of all, let me go back before Trump 1. And, I was always a career guy. So you noted 30 plus years in the US government, most of those at USTR. I was in Geneva for 6 years. In the early days of the WTO, I was the assistant USTR for WTO and multilateral before I did South and Central Asia. I personally had a lot of experience negotiating with India multilaterally in Geneva in the WTO. And it was always difficult. It was never fun. The accomplishments were few. So this goes back over some years, really, in fact, since the creation of the WTO. And I think it really came to a head in the WTO. Just to put the relevance of the WTO in perspective, its declining relevance goes back to well before the first Trump administration. There were negotiations in the Doha round on market access, a circumstance certainly from a U.S. perspective in which the big developing countries really weren't belling up to the table and putting serious market access offers on the table. And this really is in the area of tariffs. And really trying to engage seriously. And eventually those negotiations did blow up, essentially. The Doha round never concluded. And a large part of it was the failure to continue with progressive liberalization and tariffs. What had been done in previous decades could not be replicated in the WTO. So that certainly was an experience involving a number of countries, but the US and India played central roles. The Trump administration, the Trump 1.0, we had a situation in which there had always been a lot of problems on trade restrictions. And, it goes both ways. It's a two-way street, but certainly many of India's trading partners has viewed government policies and position in place, trade restrictive measures as being particularly difficult to tackle. And there's always been a challenge of having leverage for a negotiation. That did change during the Trump 1.0 administration. The US USTR, and I was the assistant USTR at the time for South and Central Asia, initiated a review of India's benefits under the GSP program, the Generalized System of Preferences programs, which essentially got India to the table. And we started negotiating seriously. I retired from USTR at that point in time. Negotiations continued, and it got very close to a significant deal. It's always been referred to as a mini trade deal, but it was really bigger than mini. It was going to roughly cover $10 billion of bilateral trade. Ultimately, it did fall apart, even though it got very close to conclusion. And I think that's because President Trump didn't view it as big enough, even though it was quite big. During the Biden administration, there's been continuing work. There was continuing work bilaterally on difficult issues, but the ambition on trade in the Biden administration was, in fact, quite low, and there being limited leverage points. Now we are in a situation with Trump 2.0. It's chaotic. It's it's difficult to predict where things go, as Nina laid out. But the threat of tariffs is having an impact, and certainly bilaterally, where the two sides have agreed to start negotiating a bilateral trade agreement, a BTA. And I'm trying to be optimistic about this. I think there are really good prospects for the two sides to seize the opportunity. Again, Nina referenced this, and engage in a even bigger negotiation than during the first Trump administration, and perhaps do a short-term tariff deal. That's going to be really difficult to do to avoid the reciprocal tariffs, but longer term, to do a first tranche agreement by the fall, to continue negotiations for a larger BTA, which is not being called a free trade agreement, but looks pretty much like a free trade agreement. Legally, it's not, but the substance is going to be very close to that. So I'm hopeful about prospects for that.
Okay. Do you have a sense of how they're going to implement these bilateral reciprocal tariffs? Because you have literally thousands of line items of different products, and a different rate for a different product from a different country would be madness. Do you have a sense of what they're planning to do there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good characterization, madness. If that were the plan, it would be very complicated. Essentially, would envision bespoke tariff schedules for every single major market. Certainly those with which the U.S. has a trade deficit and a trading partner that has high tariffs. My understanding is that there's an effort being made to not make it overly complicated. And the plan seems to be to look at calculating simple average tariffs for each country, each of the target countries. In fact, WTO provides this information. India's simple average applied tariff rate is roughly 17%. So basically using a number like that to calculate additional reciprocal tariffs. What complicates things a little bit is the plan to quantify and develop a tariff equivalent for non-tariff barriers, which is, that's not an exact science. So that will be a factor in looking at the level of tariffs that might be applied to any of these target countries. Hopefully it can be avoided with India. I wouldn't give it better than even odds chances. But they are negotiating this week. My former deputy, Brendan Lynch, is leading the U.S. delegation. They are negotiating this week, and the first priority is to see if they can do a tariff deal, a short-term tariff deal, that might avoid or might mitigate the reciprocal tariffs in April.
Okay, that's great. Vijay, is India really the tariff king? What are our tariff rates like?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The US president kind of characterized India as the tariff king, and admittedly, India has high tariff rates, as Mark also mentioned. So the World WTO website actually provides 2x2 matrix of the tariff rates. The first one is the simple average. The second one is weighted average. And when we look at India and the US, we find that while the simple average is 17% for India, it's about 3.3% for US. When we look at the trade weighted average, it is about 13% for India and 2.2% for the US. So quite clearly, India has a significantly higher tariff rates insofar as US is concerned. And when we look at the tariff differential both for the other Asian countries, we also see that the differential is much higher. Now go back to the previous slide, Mark, and it's in the other panel. So what we find is that the differential vis-a-vis US is significantly higher for India than other countries. But I just want to point out here that if you look at the last two countries, which is Vietnam and Hong Kong, we find that the effective tariff for US actually is higher. So if President Trump was to actually live by his promise, then he would be expected to reduce the tariff on the goods coming in from Hong Kong and Vietnam. Perhaps not likely to be done. Before I close, in the interest of time, I just wanted to say that when you hear the US administration today, tariff appears to be the silver bullet which can answer all questions, including drug trafficking to some country trying to buy oil from Venezuela. We've never had this kind of a situation. Like if we were to discuss tariff on the product that we are going to import or export, it's understandable. But bringing in all kind of non-tariff, non-trade issues is a lot more difficult. So in my presentation, what we've tried to do is to focus simply on the trade and the tariff as a tool for that, bringing in non-tariff because that, as Mark said, fairly complicates the situation, but it complicates it in an entirely different way than what is sometimes presented as saying that, you know, India has a huge lot of non-tariff barriers as well. Indeed, we have, but when we look at the picture subsequently, we'll see it's quite different. Yeah.
Okay. Gaurav, what are the key products that India exports to the US which could potentially be subject to these reciprocal tariffs?
Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen before I start. Just 1 second. All right. All right. So basically, India's exports to US accounts for 18% of our overall exports. So US is our key largest trading partner. So definitely the reciprocal tariffs can have an impact. In terms of what are our key exports to the US, the chart on the left-hand side basically shows that out of our total exports to the US, around 16% is electrical machinery equipment. Then we have pearls and semi-precious stones and metals, which is around 11%. Pharmaceutical products, which have been in the news also, 11% of our total exports to the US. And followed by we have textile, apparel, clothing, which is around 10%. The chart on the right gives you the market share. For example, let's say you look at pharmaceuticals. India's exports of pharmaceuticals to the US accounts for around 38% share of overall India pharmaceutical exports. So it gives you the relevance or the market dominance that the US has in these particular categories. So for example, for a lot of these categories, US is more than 30% of the total exports in that particular segment for India. For example, electrical machinery accounts for around 31% of total India electrical machinery exports. So it's definitely one of our key trading partners.
Okay. Do you see these exports being heavily impacted if these tariffs come into effect?
So as our earlier panelists have said that there is definitely, I think, greater hope that we could reach a deal with the US. Just today, there was news that came out that India is basically working on a plan where they would reduce the tariffs on almost 50% plus of the imports that we import from the US. So there is, I would say, a good chance that India and the US are able to reach a bilateral agreement to prevent this sort of reciprocal tariff. But in case the reciprocal tariff comes in, and also we don't know the form, this particular table just takes the tariff differential that, let's say, if you look at the column for India, that India imposes on the US minus what the US imposes on India. This is a simple average. So if, let's say, in the bear case scenario, the reciprocal tariff comes into effect, then you can see an impact on agriculture products, animal product exports, food product exports, textiles, leather product, where the differential is pretty on the higher side. But I would still say I would give a much higher chance of a deal getting struck for India, because while, yes, on a tariff differential metric, we look quite on the sort of the higher end compared to the other countries, but we are not the real pain point for the US. India accounts for only 3% share in total US imports. I think the real focal points in this entire tariff war, or the sort of that is initiated under President Trump's second phase, will remain countries such as Mexico, Canada, Mexico, Canada, China, which have double-digit share in US imports. India, yes, on a pure tariff differential metric, we do look adverse, but we are only 3% share in the overall US imports. So we are not really the real problem area. But yes, in case the reciprocal tariff does get implemented, you can see some moderation in overall the sector specific hit. So for example, the certain sectors such as agriculture, leather, footwear, the impact will also be on overall global growth, global trade volume, because the second phase of the trade war under the second term of President Trump is much more broad based. The first phase was more China specific. So there was a way to escape. For example, China was able to actually increase its trade surplus despite despite the focus on the increase in the US tariffs on China, because they were able to reroute their exports via other Asian currencies to the US. So even though on paper China's trade surplus with the US is coming down, but you will see there is a corresponding increase of China trade surplus with other Asian countries. This time, because of the broad-based nature, that sort of rerouting may not be possible. So I would say the impact from softer global growth or moderation in India export growth, we would estimate the impact on India GDP to be still limited. It's at max around 50 basis points in terms of real GDP growth impact in case the reciprocal tariff comes into effect.
Okay. So if we do have a bilateral trade agreement, that means that Indian customs duties on import of products manufactured in the US would be greatly reduced. What's the effect of that on the Indian industry? Because obviously customs duties are in force in order to protect the domestic industry.
So if you look at the top left-hand side chart, this basically, so in overall India imports, US accounts for around 7% share in our overall imports. And if you look at out of the total imports from the US, 31% of the imports are fuels, 11% is pearls, precious stones, etc. So I think the deal would be again, we don't know the details, but it will be, I think, a combination of reduced tariffs. It will also be a combination of increased imports of certain items. For example, crude oil from the US, or another speculation would be defense imports from the US. But overall, I would say I don't think it'll impact our industry to such an extent. For example, if you look at agricultural imports, where there's the largest trade differential, and if that's slashed, agriculture. If you look at the table on the right, agricultural imports from the US it's not much as a proportion of our total imports. So it's around 0.1% of our total imports. You look at textiles, it's only 0.1% of our total imports. So I don't think that it'll flood the market. Yes, certain segments you might feel the pain, but a deal reached with the US will be little less negative than the reciprocal tariff coming into effect.
Okay, interesting. Mark, I think one of the concerns for the US is not just about barriers, but also not just about tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers. So what exactly is the US concern here? And I mean, don't countries have a right to set their own standards for their markets? And don't those standards anyway apply to Indian manufacturers?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Well, first, it's important to realize that non-tariff barriers have broad scope. They have a variety of characteristics from regulatory action, so-called technical regulations or technical barriers to trade, to import licensing with different impacts. Import licensing, for example, and despite some of the mythology, the license Raj is still present, not like it was in decades past, but there still are some import licensing restrictions that affect trade, and they can actually lead to a situation in which there is no trade there, that there are no imports as a result of certainly some of the more restrictive import licensing requirements. On the technical barriers to trade side, they certainly can be legitimate, and the WTO TBT agreement recognizes the legitimacy of technical regulations, essentially requirements that are mandatory for goods to meet. And those that have legitimate objectives, for example, protecting human lives and human health, are WTO consistent, unless they are more trade restrictive than necessary to meet an objective, or they do not use international standards where those exist. And there's not a good excuse for not using international standards. So that can be a situation in which trade can still flow, but it doesn't flow as much as it would if international best practices were being followed. So, I expect that some of the most significant non-tariff barriers will be discussed this week. For example, the focus is on tariffs and the immediate response to reciprocal tariffs that could come into place in April. But I think certain non-tariff barriers will be discussed as well, and whether those impacts whether they can be eliminated or those impacts can be gradually minimized, so that it essentially paves the way for the bigger negotiation to come on a bilateral trade agreement.
Thanks, Mark. Vijay, I think you've heard the frustrations of multiple international clients, dealing with India and having to deal with quality control orders and certifications and so on. Can you explain a little bit about what those frustrations are?
Yeah, it's much easier to understand tariffs than to understand non-tariffs. That this is the way it is computed, and India has a high tariff, and it's pretty much well known. But some of the non-tariff measures that India has and in particular relating to what are called now the QCO's, quality control orders, which essentially is that there is a standard Bureau of Indian Standards and there are prescribed standards that were to be met. Quite often we have a situation where there are global standards which are if I was to use a word which carefully superior. Even in those cases, the requirement under the QCO is not so much the quality standard, but the institutional requirement, which essentially means that they need to get the certification from the BIS. And BIS, because certainly there have been a plethora of QCOs that have been issued with the objective to improve the quality of goods which are being manufactured in India, as well as imported into the country. So all the QCOs actually are binding even on the domestic manufacturers. Nonetheless, what happens is that because the licensing is required for the BIS units to go in the unit, the commodities which are mentioned in a particular schedule, there the officers actually need to physically visit and assure themselves that the production process, etc., is compliant with the requirement. In those cases, what is happening is that the time that is being taken in issuing the license under the BIS is taking a lot of time. It is a frustration, not just for the foreign exporters, including the Indian importers, because at the end of the day, we have to realize that for any country to increase its trade, it has to be a larger and stronger part of the global value chain. And for that, to increase exports, you have to streamline the import process as well. And there, perhaps, as was pointed out, it is possible that some of the major pain points which have come up in the area of non-tariff barriers actually get resolved, particularly for the products where US is the main exporter. It's an entirely possible thing. And perhaps if that was to happen, there would be a collateral benefit of the entire development which is happening.
So I guess if the non-tariff barriers aim were not really to prevent imports, but just to set standards, then two things India could do. One is to align our standards with global standards, and two is to allow for international certifications that could possibly make the pain a lot less, right?
That would be true, but if there was to be a bilateral agreement, it is much easier to handle. And one of the things that is done in these areas is what is called MRA, mutual recognition agreement. Like if I was to give a very simple example, the food certification by India is accepted by Bhutan and Bhutan by India. So there are multiple examples of standards being accepted mutually through a bilateral agreement, and that is an area which I'm sure US and India would be exploring for certain specified products where both countries have very specific interests.
Okay. I want you to talk a bit about the US's non-tariff barriers, because I guess Indian exporters face some difficulty also in getting certifications overseas, particularly, cost issues. So could you talk a little bit about that? And I'll just put up your slide on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, I work now in the international trade area, not just in India, but in Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and I've had 30 years of experience in India. If India was accused of being the tariff king, I would say that I'm accepting this accusation till the time the US is willing to accept the accusation of being the non-tariff king. Because the country which has reported to the WTO the largest number of TBT is actually the United States. And it is, when the discussions happen, it is said that these are legitimate. The biggest problem with the international trade that has happened over a period of time is that each country tries to pick and choose and says this one is legitimate, this one is not. Because if we were to refer to TBT and say that all the TBT measures have been WTO compliant, the fact of the matter would be that all the tariffs imposed by India, how high as they are also WTO compliant. The WTO agreement recognized that the developed countries would have lower tariff rates and the developing countries would have higher tariff rates. And if one was to make a very general statement, it would be that both the developing countries and the developed countries are trying to protect what I would say their national interest, which would sometimes convert into trying to protect their domestic manufacturing. The developing countries do that by a more crude, transparent tool of tariff, whereas the developed countries do that through TBTs and more complicated issues. I studied this subject in detail, and I can tell you that the impact of non-tariff barriers is many, many times higher than the tariff barriers.
Okay.
Nonetheless, I also recognize that sometimes putting these kind of measures, as indeed has been done by India in some of the cases, could be self-defeating and could actually inhibit the country joining the global value chain.
Okay. Mark, do you think the US needs to relook its non-tariff barriers? Or, I mean, I get the sense developed countries, believe we need to set high standards for ourselves, and the developing countries just have to follow our standards. Is there some unfairness there, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I do think that a negotiation on a bilateral trade agreement should be a two-way street, that this isn't, this should not be a dynamic in which the US has demands and expects those demands to be met and is offering nothing in return. And I certainly think that there could be situations in which Indian exporters face US non-tariff barriers, and those should be discussed. Those should be better understood, and potentially be part of a deal. I will highlight in terms of WTO TBT stats, it depends on who is notifying and how consistent each WTO member is in notifying all of its potential measures. And I'm not suggesting that India is not vigilant in notifying technical regulations that would qualify for notification under the TBT agreement, but certainly there are plenty of countries who are not fully notifying their actions, their measures. So, it's a rough measure, and it has its limitations. Setting aside the issue of whether it's a technical regulation that meets WTO requirements, that has a legitimate objective, that is not a disguised restriction on trade, that is not more trade restrictive than necessary. And those are the relevant considerations. I think, though, bilaterally, an area where there's tremendous potential, a tremendous opportunity to resolve issues on both sides is in agriculture. It's in the area of SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And, these can be situations in which the regulatory agencies for the United States at USDA, for India, like FSSAI, basically the impetus coming from USTR and the trade agencies and from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. But, for the regulatory agencies to better align their SPS measures and provide more avenues and resources devoted to those avenues on both sides to allow more trade or to allow the start of trade in certain agriculture commodities. I think there's been success in the past. It's limited, but I think that should be a priority area going forward, where there could be U.S. action to accommodate imports from India while meeting U.S. SPS standards. A lot of times it's just devoting the attention and the resources to a particular commodity from a particular country. So I guess the short answer is yes. That there should be this should be allow for approaches for the U.S. to look at some of our non-tariff barriers.
Coming to since we were talking about WTO, Nina, what is the role of the WTO regime here? And I also had a question about can one country reduce customs tariffs just for imports from one specific country? Does the WTO allow that, and how would one navigate that?
Well, it's a great question about the WTO, and Mark addressed this a bit earlier. I'm not quite sure what role the WTO has in all of this. In fact, from the U.S. perspective, at least from the Washington perspective, I should say, with the current administration, the U.S. has decided to approach all of this unilaterally, as I had mentioned earlier. Think about it this way. The WTO has had sort of three major pillars, right? There were the trade negotiations. There's the dispute settlement process to resolve disputes between countries. And then the third was the tariff schedules, where there were principles that, to your question, underlying your question, Stephen, about countries imposing the same tariff for all other trading partners, known as the most favored nation principle. Well, let's think about this. What do we have left at the WTO, right? Number one, there have been no negotiations, right? No major trade negotiations, no major trade negotiating round since 1994. There have been attempts, some smaller agreements undertaken, but on the whole, the base texts are from, are how old now? 30 years old. Number two, we look at the dispute settlement system. For several years now, going back to the first Trump administration and before, the dispute settlement system is not working at the WTO because there's no appeals process. There's no appellate body. So that's the second pillar, not working. The third pillar, tariffs. So the unilateralism that the U.S. has undertaken has really overshadowed the other actions that others have been taking for years in terms of protectionism, right? So the U.S. was the sort of the standard bearer of keeping the tariff rates as negotiated, and that also is not working. So I'm not exactly sure what is working about the WTO. And I think, recently the USTR put out a report indicating its concerns about the WTO. The US has not pulled out of the WTO, but I think there is some very significant, questions about for what the WTO and the future of the global trading system in terms of a rules-based system really may look like.
Okay. Let's turn to services for a while. So all of this talk about trade imbalances is basically about export of goods. But what about services? Because India, I think now exports more services than goods to the US. And the US also has its, online digital services that's earning income, all over the world. So Gauda, could you tell us a bit about on the services side and what kind of role it plays in trade between India and the US?
Sure. So I'll just put this slide on presentation mode. So this particular slide, the left-hand side is the trade balance and the goods services balance with the US. So it's between India and the US. We've taken this data from the US because India does not give you country-wise breakup for their services trade. So we got this data from the US perspective. So India, based on this data, has a a surplus in goods with the US of around $46 billion. And the the services surplus with the US on a net basis is not that much as per this data, which we've taken from the US, which is around, I think, $0.5 billion. So on the right-hand side, we've plotted the actual India goods exports to the US and India services exports to the US. Again, data taken from the US. So actually the goods trade is still significantly higher. Services, because India has a higher market share, software services comes into the picture, but goods merchandise trade has a much longer history. Services is more of a recent history. So that's why globally the trade in merchandise is always a bit larger than services. Services is more recent. But definitely, India exports around $41 billion to the US in terms of services. Goods, in terms of gross basis, is around $87 billion. In terms of impact, and will the US target India in terms of services, I think that's not going to enter the trade wars, because I think on the services side, the US has a surplus overall with all countries. So they will not want to bring in services into the trade negotiations. For India, I think the impact or the risk from these trade wars on the service side is still limited, because we have a real competitive advantage on services exports, specifically software services, which can't be bridged by other countries. And it'll be more detrimental, actually, for the US to put limitation on services. Another point why services is difficult to target, it's difficult to put a tariff on services. It's easier to put tariff on goods. And services, there'll be maybe non-tariff barriers are more operative. But given the nature of the exports, the software services, and the comparative advantage that India offers, which there is not much of a replacement globally, I think services remains protected for now.
I guess with goods, they move physically across the border. There's a customs agent there who can evaluate what are the goods and what is the tariff, whereas services are mostly sent digitally. And you have so many of these GCCs in India. You have software vendors in India. I mean, it would seem like a nightmare to impose tariff on services. Vijay, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I broadly agree with Gaurav that we are not likely to see services enter into negotiation. One, globally, we do not have tariffs on services, partly also for the reason that it's far more difficult. Even domestically, if you see that between the taxes on goods and services, which have eventually evolved into what in India now we call GST or elsewhere, the services is far more complicated to tax, and globally there is no agreement. And if we go to the WTO, in fact, there is an embargo on taxing services or even material which is electronically delivered. And that was again extended by another 2 years in the last round, which was held in Doha. Actually, some of the developing countries believe that if they were given the right to levy taxes on some of the services, it would be kind of revenue for them. And if you follow it carefully and conclude more crudely, you would say that the West actually keeps blocking the possibility of a fair right to tax services, international services, partly because that's something where the comparative advantage is with the developed country in general, though we do agree that India has acquired significant comparative advantage in export of services, and that's coming good for the country.
So I guess in services, India is somewhat aligned with the developed countries. Nina, there's a recent memo issued.
Just India's position in the WTO is that we do support the removal of the embargo, which would allow the nations to actually impose taxes. So that's the national position, which has, notwithstanding India's reservations, the embargo was extended for another 2 years.
Okay. Nina, there's a recent memo issued last week relating to digital services by the US government, where they are again looking at, countries that tax digital services provided by US companies to subscribers in those countries. Can you tell us a bit about that and what are the implications there? I noted that India was not named in that memo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and maybe just before I turn to that, maybe just a quick point on the prior conversation on services. I would just caution everyone into believing that just because services haven't been tariffed, if I can use new verb, right? If tariffed in the past, that they wouldn't be tariffed in the future. I would also caution that tariffs are not the only measures that can be used to restrict trade. You know, we've talked about some of these non-tariff barriers, but there are explicit barriers as well. We look at how companies like, for example, TikTok have been treated in terms of restrictions in the US market, whether it's through executive action or congressional action. So something sort of the pink elephant in the room we haven't talked about here in the context of services is also immigration, which is a very, very, very politically sensitive issue in the United States. So I just note that when it comes to services, there are a whole host of very complex issues that I think Indian service providers will have to navigate in the coming weeks and months and years with respect to the U.S. market. On the digital services issues, yes, Stephen, you're correct. There was a presidential action actually back in February with respect to it's called Defending American Companies and Innovators from Overseas Extortion and Unfair Fines and Penalties. And the purpose of this was to lay out the administration's policy concerns with respect to how certain tax structures, including digital services taxes, are considered market access barriers for U.S. interests internationally. And you're right, India was not named in that. We don't know whether that was simply an oversight, because in the first Trump administration, India was part of an investigation at the U.S. through the U.S. Trade Representative under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. This is one of the unilateral investigation tools by the United States of the market access impacts of India's then digital services taxes. And I think one of the things that I'm watching very closely is how the administration, even though India is not named in this presidential action, how India will be treated on this front. In the first investigation, India was not subject to restrictions or duties or any of the sort of trade measures to try to equalize any of the quantitative effects of these digital services taxes, which were calculated through that investigation. I think the resolution was that India was going to look to remove some of these measures. Also, there were ongoing global negotiations on tax, which I think alleviated some of that. But given where the Trump administration's position is on looking at market access issues for service providers, U.S. tech service providers, I think India's complex digital services regime and tax regime will be under scrutiny and through this. And I don't think we can discount that it could be part of a broader set of discussions.
Okay. Mark, I think you have some knowledge on the previous action with regard to India under Super 301. But what can you tell us about that on the services front?
Sure. I mean, I would like to go back to one really important point on WTO relevancy, and I think Nina laid out the circumstances very well, and I essentially endorse that analysis. And I essentially think that in some respects we are moving into a period in which multilateral, I mean, we all know this, but the WTO will not be relevant. It will limp along, but it won't be relevant. And it's looking a bit like circumstances between the two world wars, where it's all about tariffs, it's all about bilateral agreements. And it's pretty chaotic. I think that's what we are entering into, and maybe it gets chaotic enough that the multilateral system is recreated at some point in time when after things get really ugly. But, this is serious stuff. So I do want to highlight that. And then specifically on services, I am confident services will be part of the negotiation. I think one of the central issues that the U.S. will raise is digital services, and will certainly seek a commitment on the WTO moratorium on tariffs on e-commerce. I think that's a given. And, frankly, it's in India's interest. I mean, India uses that issue tactically in the WTO. It's a hostage, and it's a hostage for other issues like agriculture. But India, as I think you laid out, has tremendous interest in cross-border trade and services, and could be very negatively impacted if a lot of developing countries start applying tariffs to services that cross borders, certainly in the IT sector. So I think that is going to be a priority in the negotiation. And I'm really interested in Nina's point that don't kid yourself in thinking that there will not be efforts because of the impracticalities to restrict services trade. I mean, it's harder, no doubt about it. But, I could imagine the administration finding ways to do that. So, I think we need to watch that space very closely.
Yeah, the reality is that precedent has no relevance to President Trump, right? He'll do whatever he thinks is best, and what's been done in the past is not really relevant to him. So we'll start with the two people who are in consulting here, just to round up as we finish the hour. I'll start with Vijay and then go to Nina. What are you advising clients, whether it's Indian companies exporting to US or US companies importing from India or anywhere else? What's your guidance to them? We'll start with Vijay.
Yeah.
Just a quick
So-
1 minute final comments.
Sure. So essentially, what the two extremes, if there were binary situation, one is that India reduces the tariff to meet the US tariffs, which is to reduce the tariffs in India. Or the other thing was to actually not do that, and US actually increases the tariff to the Indian levels. If these were the two binary situations, our modeling suggests that Indian industry and Indian economy is better off with US imposing tariff rather than India reducing the tariff all the way down to 3%. However, we realize that the implications actually and the real play is product specific and sector specific. And therefore, our advice essentially is to different industry like, pharma, where the export, as was pointed out by Gaura, is that there is a massive export from India, and US is a major market. So should there be an increase in the duty in the US, notwithstanding the fact that such a measure would lead to increase in prices of generic medicine in the US, will be very adversely affected. I'm deliberately not referring to agriculture, which for sure is a major issue, because I genuinely believe that both the countries not get into agriculture and the solutions would be found in non-agricultural areas. So therefore, and the other industry, perhaps if we were to take the other extreme, is the possibility of reducing the tariffs on the automobile sector, which has been specifically pointed out by the president to have a rate of duty in excess of 100%. India in the current budget actually reduced the tariff on some of the inputs going into the EV, but not for the EVs. India laid out a specific scheme for attracting FDI in the EV sector. So we think that there would be play in two specific sectors, and our advice to the industry essentially is based on where we think that the impact would be more negative if US was to hike the rate of duty, or where the domestic industry would be greatly impacted if the government of India agreed to reduce the tariff very significantly there.
Okay. Nina?
Yeah, those are all really good points. I think, one point before I get to the what I'm looking at for companies, to date in this call, we have only talked about the prospect of tariffs being negotiated down. What we haven't talked about is the prospect that tariffs could also go up. So I think that it's also a risk I think we need to contemplate both on the US side, but if there is a lack of agreement on the Indian side, we talking about Mark's reference to the pre-World War situation, that's what happened, right? There was an increase of tariffs that was a tit for tat across countries that led to just higher tariffs and higher market access barriers between countries. So that I think it's just the point is that I think we're in a very uncertain environment that it can make challenging for business planning ahead. And this environment requires companies really to be nimble, not think only defensively, but also offensively about dynamic trade conditions. And the devil's really going to be in the details of all the different moving pieces that we've been talking about today. Some of the things that I advise my clients. So first, knowing your footprint. So where are your greatest vulnerabilities, both in India, in the United States? If there is, under a situation, if there is retaliation on either side, where do you source your product from? Where do you produce? Where do you sell? Things like customs determinations. Customs is really a very big part of my practice these days because elements like country of origin, harmonized tariff schedule, valuation of products are all really important in terms of what your duty exposure is, what your trade exposure is from your business standpoint. What do your contractual provisions look like for your suppliers and customers? Who bears the cost, for example, of these additional tariffs, to Vijay's point? Are you managing your inventories intentionally? How are you hedging your currency risk? I think internal socialization of your business to all of these risks and opportunities and developing those internal mechanisms to be able to cope with this dynamic environment. Again, developing these contingencies. To what extent can there be diversification of supply chains, insourcing, redoing your supply chains, creating your redundancies? What are your options? Are there new ways to source your products, new suppliers? It can be very challenging depending on your industry to do that. Takes time. So I think planning in advance, very, very, very critical. And then what does your compliance program look like? In being able to cope with these confluence of trade tools, whether it's tariffs, sanctions, or export restrictions, are you ready to be able to meet compliance requirements that may come at you? And then making sure you have good intelligence and also are working with your US importers. I think, one of the things that, in terms of effect, a lot of the actions that are ongoing on trade in the US are very likely going to have effects on parts of the U.S. importing economy, and having those good relationships with the businesses you work with in the U.S. Could also be really critical in terms of moving the ball forward and raising how these barriers, both on the Indian side but also on the U.S. side, may affect business and may affect the relationship.
Okay. Gara, what's your conclusion after this debate on the effect on the Indian economy from the tariffs or from the reduction of Indian customs duties?
So definitely would advocate a deal to be reached with the US because it will be a less adversarial path and it will also prevent the trade wars spilling into other areas. So definitely a deal reached by both India and the US will be much more beneficial and it will limit the sort of further escalation of trade tensions. As I mentioned before, the good news for India is that we are a domestic demand-driven economy. We have basically the world's largest population. We are a consumer market. So yes, maybe in global trade, our footprint is a is on the lower side. But I think the greatest defense for India is the fact that we are one of the only economies in the world that has a positive demographic dividend. So if for the next 20 to 25 years, our median age population will only get younger and younger. And that's a market that you do not want to lock yourself out of. So that is an effective tool that we can use to limit any sort of escalation in trade wars. Because right now, the sort of trade wars that are revived under the second term of President Trump is happening in a world where globalization, I think, is the way forward, especially when you have global value chains and getting more integrated in global value chains and having more focus on areas where each economy has its own comparative advantage. For example, how many countries can replace the ability of India to supply skilled labor force, especially in the software? It's a very difficult thing to replace. Again, so that's one of the strengths and I think this whole move towards escalation, deglobalization, creating tariff barriers, it's going to be bad for everybody in the long term. You look at what had happened in the first phase of the trade wars under President Trump, where he targeted China. I agree, the first phase was a little more narrow, so China was able to effectively reshape the global value chain and still get its exports to the US via other Asian currencies. There is a comparative advantage of China, which can't get replaced. So I would never advocate for any country to use protectionism as a way to grow domestic industry. So again, from a long-term perspective, if India is able to reach an agreement which looks likely with the US, it'll basically put a full stop to further escalation or spread of the trade tension in other areas. It'll also force our own industries to focus more on innovation, productivity, ease of doing business, because I think the way forward is to get more integrated in the global value chain rather than putting up walls. And in terms of impact, it'll be a limited impact because we are a domestic demand-driven economy.
Thanks, Gaurav. Mark, I'll leave the final word for you, but I have a few concerns about the bilateral trade agreement. So the first one is I just wonder whether you have a sense of what's an ideal balanced kind of agreement that kind of protects and looks out fairly at the interests of both parties. Two is, I mean, I don't think it's going to be possible to do this in the next 4 or 5 days. So what does that mean? And then I wanted to read out a quote which I found on the Wall Street Journal. It said, the US feels it will have the strongest hand, one foreign official said last week, if everyone is on a burning platform as talks happen. Does that mean that if there's no comprehensive deal by the end of this week, then President Trump will say, let the reciprocal tariffs hit India and we'll be in a stronger position to conclude this deal? Your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And really concluding thought. So, and this goes to one of the points that Gaurav just raised. And I think it's important to understand there's leverage on both sides. It's been obvious that there's leverage on the US side with the threat of tariffs, the potential imposition of reciprocal tariffs. That is effective leverage. I mean, it creates chaos and potentially can be extremely harmful, but it's leverage. But India has leverage as well. The economy is truly too big to ignore. It will soon be the third largest economy in the world. And certainly the companies I work with recognize that. And they recognize that India has got to be part of their business plan going forward. So that is leverage, and India is hugely important on the strategic front. So the important thing is that leverage on both sides is used wisely, that it is not overplayed. That leverage is always limited, and certainly the Trump administration does run the risk of overplaying its leverage. There being responses in terms of retaliatory tariffs There being responses as markets nosedive. It's got to be used wisely. And I do think the leadership at USTR, I'm sure the same is true of Commerce, is aware of this and trying to navigate this space. Your questions on a trade, in the next 4 or 5 days, the best thing that could be accomplished is a short-term tariff deal, which will be very, very hard to accomplish. It's hard to imagine that Minister Goyal will have the authority to lower tariffs so that the simple average across the board is 3.4%, the level of the US simple average. I mean, that's just, I can't imagine any country being able to do that in a matter of days. Can it get partly there? And the response being a delay in imposition of reciprocal tariffs? I think that's a big question. And that is a possibility. Might there be a situation in which India gets partly there and the US reciprocal tariffs are at a lower level, 4 or 5% across the board versus, 15% across the board. So that may be a possibility. The important thing is that regardless of whether a short-term tariff deal is reached or not, they continue negotiation. The two leaders agreed to a bilateral trade agreement, which again, I think will look a lot like an FTA, even though not called an FTA. They need to continue negotiation. The stakes are just too high. They have a deadline of a first tranche by the fall. It won't be concluded by the fall. It's a first tranche. And then negotiations should continue into 2026, ideally for a big deal. So that's kind of my perspective. Sorry, I forgot your first question related to that, but I mean, that's how I would sum things up.
Okay, yeah. It was really on what you think would be the most balanced kind of deal. I think you more or less answered that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But both sides have to win. I mean, this notion of it being zero-sum game is, it doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work between the US and India. And during the first Trump administration, if a deal had been struck, a so-called mini deal, there would have been winners on both sides. I mean, there was a recognition of that the first time around. So I'm hopeful there will be a recognition of that in this negotiation that is essentially being initiated now.
That's great. That's a very positive way for us to end today. I thank all our speakers. This was a fantastic discussion, and I certainly earned a lot. Thank you very much, and thanks also from the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. And just a quick word to all the participants. The Indo-American Chamber of Commerce is an apex chamber focused on fostering trade between India and the US. We have a lot that we can offer to you as members. So if any of you are not members and would like to become members, do email us. Thank you, everyone, and we will close with that.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.